In geopolitics, hesitation is an invitation. And over the last 15 years, Russia and China have RSVP'd repeatedly. Crimea, Syria, Hong Kong, the South China Sea, moments when Washington blinked and Moscow or Beijing moved. But this isn't just about timing anymore. It's about coordination, shared drills, shared weapons, shared language about a world no longer led by the West. This is how two powers, different in style, united in strategy, began shaping the rules they plan to replace. Start.
Okay, headfirst into the intense world of global competition.
It's certainly a busy landscape out there.
Forget the surface headlines for a minute. We've got a stack of sources, reports, analyses, you name it, that give us maybe a clearer picture of how major powers like Russia and China are navigating this complex landscape.
Yeah, looking beyond the day-to-day noise.
Specifically, we're zeroing in on a pattern the sources highlight. How Moscow and Beijing seem to identify and, well, potentially take advantage of moments when the U.S. is perceived to hesitate, shift policy, or simply get distracted by other priorities.
It's this theme of, strategic opportunism that keeps coming up in the material. Like they're constantly scanning the horizon of U.S. foreign policy.
It's looking for those gaps.
Moments of uncertainty, policy shifts, or just when attention seems focused elsewhere. And seeing those as, well, potential openings to advance their own goals.
Today is simple. Pull out the most important insights and help you understand what's really happening below the surface. We'll cover some surprising details.
Sounds good. Where do you want to start? Russia? China?
Let's start by looking at Russia. The sources lay out some pretty specific examples of how they've seemingly capitalized on these perceived openings.
Okay. A really significant case highlighted in the sources is the 2008 Russo-Georgian War.
Right, 2008. Context is key there, wasn't it? NATO aspirations for Georgia and Ukraine.
Just after the Bucharest summit signaled that future membership possibility, which Russia fiercely opposed, and the timing, the U.S. was deeply tied up.
Iraq and Afghanistan. Still very heavy engagement.
Very heavy. Plus, adding to the distraction, the Beijing Olympics were happening right then.
A perfect storm, almost. And Putin had already given that confrontational speech in Munich the year before.
Yeah, the 2007 speech. Red flags were raised, but maybe there was still an underestimation, of just how far Russia would go against non-NATO states looking west.
So how did Russia act, according to the sources?
Well, they detail how Russia escalated tensions using separatists in South Ossetia as a lever. Then, when Georgia responded on August 7th,
Russia launched a large-scale incursion.
Big time. Not just in South Ossetia, but beyond it. They captured Abkhazia too, and then moved to recognize their independence.
And the sources point to something else significant here, right? The method.
Yes. What makes this case particularly notable, according to the analysis, is its pioneering use of what we now call integrated hybrid warfare.
Hybrid warfare.
Yeah.
Meaning it wasn't just tanks and troops moving in.
It was military force combined with other tools. Specifically, the sources point out this was one of the first major state uses of significant cyber attacks alongside military operations.
What kind of cyber attacks?
We saw denial of service attacks, DDoS, hitting Georgian government websites, even website defacements, some comparing the Georgian president to Hitler, which was quite something. It was a real test bed for combining those domains.
Okay, so military action plus cyber attacks.
Yeah.
How did the U.S. and the West react? What did the sources say?
The U.S. condemned it strongly, called it an unacceptable invasion. They provided humanitarian and economic aid to Georgia, around $1 billion, and deepened the strategic partnership.
And there was a ceasefire.
Yes, an EU-brokered ceasefire agreement was put in place.
But the critiques in these sources, they're pretty sharp, aren't they? Arguing the response wasn't really enough.
That's the core critique. Things like limited sanctions, no talk of direct military intervention, and the fact that Russia didn't even fully comply with withdrawing forces under the ceasefire terms.
So the argument is this signaled something.
The analysis suggests it signaled a low threshold for Western tolerance of Russian military action in its near abroad, especially against countries not formally under the NATO security umbrella. It arguably emboldened Russia.
A lesson learned for them, maybe, for 2014.
That's the argument. It was a learning experience they applied later. The perception was that the U.S. was either unable or perhaps unwilling to respond more forcefully, maybe because they were overstretched.
Which brings us directly to that much larger incident, the annexation of Crimea and the conflict kicking off in Donbass in 2014.
Yeah, and this followed a period where the Obama administration's attempt at a reset with Russia was, well, clearly faltering. Disagreements were piling up.
Yeah, and there was another moment the sources often flag it before that, right? Syria.
The handling of the Syrian chemical weapons red line in 2013. That decision to pull back from planned military strikes and instead opt for a diplomatic deal brokered with Russia.
That was widely seen as U.S. indecision.
Widely, and a real blow to U.S. credibility, according to many analyses at the time.
And maybe characterizing Russia as just a regional power around then also played a part, underestimating Putin's risk appetite.
That's a key insight mentioned in the sources. So, as the Maidan Revolution unfolded in Ukraine, the perception, according to the reporting, was that the U.S. and Europe responded slowly and cautiously to Russia's first moves.
And Russia didn't wait. They moved fast.
Very fast. Capitalized swiftly.
With those infamous little green men showing up in Crimea.
These covert, deniable forces seizing control points, then followed by that disputed referendum and, boom, formal annexation announced on March 18th, 2014.
And it wasn't just Crimea.
No, almost simultaneously, Russia began actively supporting, fueling the separatist movement in Ukraine's Donbas region, providing money, weapons, material, military support, even troops and leadership, though Moscow denied it. That sparked the long war there.
Okay, so the West responds. Condemnation, sanctions.
Yes, the US and EU condemned it, implemented sanctions targeting specific individuals, key state-owned companies in finance, energy, defense sectors, and entities operating in Crimea. Pretty broad scope.
But again, the sources suggest maybe these weren't enough to change the game.
The critique in the analysis is consistent. The sanctions, while imposing real economic costs, weren't punitive enough to fundamentally alter Russia's strategic calculus or deter the deepening conflict in Donbas.
And the military aid to Ukraine was limited at first.
Initially, yes. The U.S. provided only non-lethal aid. Providing lethal weapons was heavily debated, but held back for quite some time, largely due to, well, fears of escalating the conflict directly with Russia.
So that fear of escalation, some analysts in the sources call it U.S. self-deterrence.
That's the term used. Essentially, the idea that the U.S. was deterring itself from taking stronger actions because of concern about how Russia might react. Russia's perceived high resolve versus a U.S. priority on de-escalation.
And the argument is that this caution, meant to prevent things from spiraling, actually failed to reestablish credible deterrence.
That's the argument. It perhaps contributed to the annexation of Crimea becoming a sort of normalized fact on the ground and allowed the Donbas conflict to just simmer, then boil over later.
The sanctions did hurt Russia economically, though.
They did cause damage, yes. But Russia proved resilient, partly helped by Europe's continued reliance on its energy exports at the time, and partly because Russia adapted its economy. And the lack of a truly unified, severe initial response from the West probably diluted the impact.
Okay, let's shift gears again. Syria, 2015 onwards. Another incredibly messy conflict, and U.S. policy seemed complicated.
Definitely complicated. And the sources again point back to that 2013 Red Line incident over chemical weapons as a moment where U.S. credibility took a hit.
And by 2015, the main U.S. military focus in the region had shifted.
Yes, the primary focus became combating ISIS. This created a complex situation on the ground where the U.S. and Russia actually had different main adversaries, even though they were operating in the same airspace sometimes.
Plus, there was just general reluctance in the U.S. for deeper military involvement after Iraq and Afghanistan.
A significant reluctance, yes. A desire to avoid getting directly entangled in the Syrian civil war itself, or direct confrontation with Assad, while still leading the fight against ISIS.
And into this complex picture, Russia steps in decisively.
They did, September 2015. At the request of the Assad government, Russia launched a direct military intervention. Air campaign, naval support, special forces on the ground, backing the Syrian army and allied militias.
They framed it as counterterrorism.
Officially, yes. But the sources note that a very heavy proportion of their strikes targeted anti-Assad opposition groups, including some that had received support from the U.S.
And the intervention worked for Russia's goals.
It was highly successful from their perspective. They successfully shored up the Assad regime, fundamentally shifted the military balance of power on the ground, and established a lasting military footprint with naval and air bases. It was a major reassertion of Russian influence in the Middle East.
So what was the U.S. response during Russia's intervention?
According to the sources, it was largely limited to establishing deconfliction channels with the Russian military.
Basically, making sure U.S. and Russian planes didn't accidentally shoot each other down while the U.S. continued its anti-ISIS campaign.
Primarily that, yes. The sources highlight that there wasn't a significant U.S. effort to directly counter Russia's intervention itself, or to enforce those earlier red lines regarding Assad's actions once Russia was fully committed on his side.
So the analysis suggests that combination of factors, the perceived U.S. indecision around the red line, the shifting priority to ISIS, created a kind of strategic vacuum.
A vacuum that Russia expertly exploited. They projected power, secured their bases, challenged U.S. influence, all with relatively little direct pushback on their core goal of saving the Assad regime. Some sources describe U.S. policy as having lagging interest or flip-flops regarding Assad's fate.
And Russia could use that counterterrorism narrative, which sort of aligned with the U.S. focus on ISIS, as cover.
Precisely. It helped legitimize their military presence internationally, even while they were pursuing much broader geopolitical objectives. And, as you mentioned, U.S. weariness from previous long interventions likely made any deeper U.S. involvement politically unappealing, creating more space for Russia to act.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. Now let's turn our attention over to China. Did the sources indicate similar patterns in how Beijing operates when it perceives these U.S. moments?
The sources highlight comparable dynamics, though maybe playing out a bit differently given China's distinct approach and different areas of focus. A major case study is the militarization of the South China Sea.
Ah, yes. This links back to the Obama administration's pivot to Asia strategy, announced back in 2011.
It does. But questions quickly arose about its tangible implementation. Was it really getting the necessary resources, the sustained high-level attention it needed?
Especially with the U.S. still heavily engaged elsewhere, like the Middle East, and facing domestic budget constraints.
And the initial U.S. reaction to China's accelerating land reclamation, building those artificial islands starting around 2013-2014, was seen by some critics, according to these sources, as too slow, insufficient, overly cautious, perhaps.
A hesitation, maybe? Fear of escalation or damaging the huge economic relationship with China?
That perception was certainly there. A reluctance to directly confront Beijing forcefully over its actions in the SCS.
And things didn't necessarily get clearer later on, right?
Yeah.
The Trump era brought its own unpredictability. Questions about alliances, reports of even a temporary pause in U.S. Navy freedom of navigation operations, the FOPs early in that administration.
Correct. Plus, a complicating factor mentioned is that the U.S. isn't actually a party to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS. That makes it harder sometimes to effectively champion a rules-based maritime order when challenging China's claims based on that very convention.
So China saw an opening and pushed ahead.
Seized it, you could say. They undertook this unprecedented large-scale land reclamation, turning submerged reefs and rocks into full-fledged artificial islands, equipping them with significant military infrastructure airfields, long enough for bombers, naval berths, radar systems, hardened shelters.
And this was despite President Xi Jinping publicly pledging in 2015 not to militarize the Spratly Islands.
Despite that pledge, yes. And they paired this physical buildup with a much more assertive presence of their maritime forces. The China Coast Guard, the maritime militia.
Using them to enforce China's claims within their self-declared 9-dash line, harassing other countries' fishing boats or survey ships.
Establishing de facto control over large areas. And of course, they outright rejected the international arbitration ruling from the Permanent Court of Arbitration in 2016, which found that their expansive historical claims had no basis in international law.
The U.S. did respond, though, right? With phone-op-ese, diplomatic pressure.
Oh, yes. The U.S. conducted phone-op-ese to challenge excessive maritime claims and assert navigation rights, increased its military presence in the region, issued strong diplomatic condemnations of the militarization and coercion, and worked to strengthen alliances and partnerships with countries in the region like the Philippines, Vietnam, Japan, Australia.
But the critiques in the sources questioned how effective these responses actually were in stopping the buildup.
That's the core debate. The effectiveness of phone-op-ese is questioned. They haven't reversed the militarization, and China often uses them as a pretext to justify its own increased deployments, claiming they need to defend their territory.
And the argument is the U.S. failed to impose significant costs early on, allowed China to literally create facts on the water.
That's a key criticism. The analysis suggests the U.S. response was often reactive, lagging behind China's actions, and China's strategy here is described as a classic example of salami slicing.
Making lots of small, incremental moves.
Each individual step, dredging sand here, building a small structure there, seems relatively minor, maybe below the threshold that would trigger a major U.S. or international response. But cumulatively, over time, these slices add up to a fundamental change in the strategic reality on the ground, or rather, on the water.
Exploiting U.S. gradualism, or maybe a reluctance to risk direct conflict over what might seem like remote rocks and reefs?
Yeah, precisely. And by the time the full extent of the militarization became undeniable, China had already established significant anti-accessory denial A2AD capabilities on these islands. Think missiles, radar, airfields. That makes it much riskier and costlier for the U.S. military to operate freely in those areas in a crisis.
So that pivot to Asia rhetoric felt strong, but the follow-through, the tangible commitment, the resources, the consistent high-level focus maybe wasn't there during that phase when China was actively changing the map.
That's the paradox highlighted in some analyses. China likely viewed the U.S. pivot as perhaps a containable challenge. They assessed that it wasn't fully backed by the necessary political will or sustained investment, especially when it came to forcefully pushing back on what Beijing considers its core interests, like its territorial claims in the South China Sea.
Okay, let's move to Taiwan, another major flashpoint. And U.S. policy here is famously complex strategic ambiguity.
Right. The U.S. policy, rooted in the Taiwan Relations Act, provides Taiwan with the means to defend itself, but doesn't explicitly state whether the U.S. military would intervene if China attacked. It was designed to deter both sides, Beijing from invading and Taipei from declaring formal independence and provoking Beijing.
But the debate highlighted in the sources is whether that ambiguity is still sufficient, given China's massive military buildup and increased assertiveness.
That's the core question now. Is ambiguity still stabilizing, or is it becoming destabilizing because it leaves too much room for miscalculation by Beijing?
And perceived inconsistencies from different U.S. administrations don't help that calculation. You mentioned President Trump questioning alliances, President Biden making statements that sometimes seem to lean towards strategic clarity before being officially walked back by the White House.
Those oscillations create confusion. Beijing monitors all of this incredibly closely and might interpret such shifts or walkbacks as signs of U.S. indecision, internal division, or lack of firm commitment.
They also watch U.S. domestic politics, election cycles,
closely, looking for potential distractions or shifts in policy priorities that might create perceived windows of opportunity. And certainly, if the U.S. is heavily focused on other major crises, like the war in Ukraine or turmoil in the Middle East, China might calculate that U.S. attention and resources are diverted away from the Indo-Pacific, potentially lowering the perceived risks of acting more assertively towards Taiwan.
And China, viewing Taiwan as a breakaway province to be unified, by force if necessary, they've definitely ramped up their pressure campaign in recent years.
Significantly ramped up. The sources detail a multi-pronged effort. There's the relentless military intimidation, a huge increase in PLA air and naval operations around the island, near daily incursions into Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, or ADAZ, frequent crossings of the sensitive Taiwan Strait median line, large-scale military exercises that explicitly simulate blockades or amphibious assaults.
This isn't just routine training. It's designed to send a message.
It's designed to intimidate Taiwan's population, wear down Taiwan's military forces through constant response requirements, and gradually normalize a much closer and more frequent Chinese military presence near the island, pushing the envelope.
And alongside the military pressure, they're using those gray zone tactics again, operating below the threshold of overt warfare.
Yes, heavily. Cyber attacks targeting Taiwanese government systems and infrastructure. Massive disinformation campaigns aimed at sowing division within Taiwanese society and eroding public trust in the government and democratic institutions. Economic coercion against Taiwanese businesses or sectors, and continuous diplomatic efforts to isolate Taiwan internationally.
This pressure escalated after 2016.
Yes, particularly after the election of the DPP, a party traditionally leaning towards independence, and again following perceived shifts in U.S. policy or high-profile interactions between U.S. and Taiwanese officials.
So China often frames its escalations like those massive military drills after then-Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit in 2022 as necessary reactions.
That's their public narrative. They frame them as defensive responses to perceived U.S. provocations or challenges to the One China principle. But the sources note this creates a very dangerous action-reaction cycle. Perceived U.S. moves towards greater support or clarity for Taiwan, trigger coercive military and gray zone responses from Beijing, which in turn might prompt further U.S. responses.
The U.S. response to this pressure has involved several elements. Accelerating arms sales to Taiwan.
Yes, focusing increasingly on asymmetric capabilities, things like anti-ship missiles, drones, air defense systems that could make an invasion very costly for China.
maintaining a visible military presence, like with Navy ships transiting the Taiwan Strait.
Regular transits, joint exercises with allies in the region, issuing strong diplomatic statements reaffirming commitments under the Taiwan Relations Act, and opposing any unilateral change to the status quo by force. And strengthening alliances, particularly through frameworks like the Quad.
But again, the core critique raised in the sources is, are these actions actually sufficient to deter a China that appears increasingly determined and capable of using force?
That's the million-dollar question. The debate over strategic ambiguity versus clarity continues precisely because there's no easy answer. Critics argue that the inconsistencies in U.S. messaging undermine deterrence by creating uncertainty about U.S. resolve.
There is skepticism about whether the U.S. and its allies would actually intervene forcefully, short of a full-scale invasion, say if China imposed a quarantine or blockade.
That's a scenario frequently debated. Would that cross the threshold for a major military response? China's escalating pressure campaign, especially using those ambiguous gray zone tactics, seems designed specifically to test U.S. commitment, probe red lines, and chip away at the credibility of U.S. security guarantees to Taiwan and its allies in the region.
They're constantly watching for signs of weakening U.S. resolve.
Constantly. Beijing monitors U.S. politics, policy debates, military deployments, and actions elsewhere in the world. Incidents like the chaotic U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, for instance, were interpreted by some analysts in Beijing, according to the sources, as potential evidence of declining U.S. staying power and willingness to bear significant costs in prolonged engagements. That kind of perception could potentially embolden their approach to Taiwan.
Let's shift again. Cyber espionage and intellectual property theft. This has been a major issue with China for a long time.
A very long-standing issue, yes. And one where the sources suggest the U.S., at least initially, struggled to mount a fully coordinated strategic response. For many years, it was often treated primarily as a law enforcement or counterintelligence problem, rather than a core strategic national security threat sponsored by a rival state.
And the sheer scale and persistence of the activity coming from Chinese actors, plus the difficulties in definitively attributing attacks quickly, made it overwhelming.
Attribution takes time, resources, and post 9/11, understandably, U.S. intelligence and cyber resources were heavily focused on counterterrorism threats, which may have diverted attention and resources away from state-sponsored espionage like China's.
There was that agreement in 2015 between the U.S. and China, specifically about commercial cyber espionage.
Yes, a diplomatic agreement reached under the Obama administration aimed at stopping cyber theft of intellectual property for commercial gain. However, the sources indicate that while it might have had some temporary effect or caused actors to shift methods, state-sponsored cyber espionage for national security purposes, intelligence gathering, and military advantage continued unabated.
And the scale of China's actions in this domain has been just massive and systematic.
Truly massive. The OPM hack, the Office of Personnel Management, discovered in 2015 but happening earlier, is a prime example. Attributed to hackers linked to China's Ministry of State Security, or MSS.
They got personnel records for millions of federal employees.
Over 22 million individuals, including highly sensitive background investigation forms, the SF-86s, containing incredibly detailed personal information, contacts, histories, even fingerprints in some cases. An absolute goldmine for counterintelligence, identifying potential recruits, understanding U.S. government structures.
And beyond government targets, there's the IP theft from corporations.
Widespread, systematic theft of intellectual property, trade secrets, research and development data from U.S. companies across virtually every major sector of the economy: aerospace, biotech, energy, IT, advanced manufacturing. The FBI director has repeatedly called it one of the largest transfers of wealth in human history.
They also target critical infrastructure.
Yes. Sources detail efforts to gain access to infrastructure networks, energy grids, transportation systems, communication networks, potentially laying groundwork for disruption in a future crisis. And alongside hacking, they utilize talent recruitment programs like the 1,000 Talents Plan, sometimes legitimately, sometimes illicitly, to facilitate the transfer of sensitive technology and know-how back to China.
The U.S. response has evolved over time. More indictments, sanctions.
Yes. The U.S. has increasingly turned to legal actions, like indicting PLA officers and other Chinese nationals allegedly involved in hacking, imposing sanctions on individuals and entities, significantly enhancing domestic cybersecurity defenses through agencies like CISA, ramping up FBI investigations and public warnings, diplomatic engagement like the 2015 agreement.
But the critiques often highlight that these actions, while necessary, have been largely reactive and perhaps haven't been sufficient to truly deter the activity on a strategic level?
That's a common theme in the analysis. The perception is that the U.S. was perhaps slow to fully grasp the strategic implications and the systemic, government-directed nature of the threat early on. The 2015 agreement, while a step, had limited long-term impact on overall state-sponsored activity. China effectively exploited the inherent openness of U.S. academic institutions, commercial networks, and even government systems.
And the sheer volume of activity just overwhelmed U.S. enforcement capacity for a long time.
Early underestimation allowed China to make significant gains before more robust countermeasures were fully implemented. China's approach is often described as a whole-of-society effort, leveraging state agencies, state-owned enterprises, contracted hackers, even academic researchers. Critics argue that U.S. responses like indictments, while important for signaling norms and seeking justice, have limited deterrent effect against a state actor that can simply shield its individuals and adapt its tactics. Real deterrence, the sources suggest, would require imposing more timely, significant, and consistent costs directly on Beijing itself, something China seems to have calculated it can often withstand if the strategic benefits of the espionage are deemed high enough. Supply chain security, highlighted by incidents like SolarWinds, though attributed to Russia, also revealed broader vulnerabilities that China could potentially exploit.
Okay, let's pivot to something different but related. China's Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, launched in 2013. It's undeniably reshaped global infrastructure development.
It certainly has. And the sources suggest that the BRI was launched, at least in part, into a perceived vacuum. There was a sense, preceding and around its launch, of U.S. retrenchment from global economic leadership, maybe less focus on large-scale infrastructure development aid, particularly in the global south.
Creating an opening that China was ready and willing to fill.
Precisely. The initial U.S. response to BRI was seen by many analysts as somewhat slow and fragmented. It consisted mainly of issuing warnings about potential downsides, the risks of unsustainable debt traps for recipient countries, lack of transparency in contracts, poor environmental and labor standards, and the potential strategic risks of China controlling infrastructure.
But the U.S. was slower to offer concrete, large-scale alternatives.
Slower, yes. Initiatives like the Blue Dot Network, launched in 2019, focused more on certifying quality infrastructure projects rather than directly financing them on a massive scale. The G7's Build Back Better World, B3W, later rebranded as the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, PGII, emerged later in 2021, aiming to mobilize private capital. But both have faced challenges in matching the sheer scale, speed of execution, and often the initial reception of BRI projects on the ground in many developing countries.
China's BRI is truly colossal in ambition, a global strategy spanning continents aimed at improving connectivity, opening new markets for Chinese goods, securing access to natural resources, building political influence.
And establishing a strategic presence, often through investments in ports, railways, pipelines, and digital infrastructure, some of which could potentially have dual civilian military uses down the line.
China frames it as a global public good contributing to shared development.
That's the official narrative. However, the sources consistently highlight the persistent concerns raised by the U.S. and others. The debt sustainability issue, where some countries have struggled to repay loans for BRI projects, the lack of transparency in bidding and contracts, adherence to international environmental and labor standards, and the potential for China to gain undue leverage or control over national infrastructure assets if countries default on loans. But China has also shown adaptability, sometimes renegotiating terms, and continues to push BRI forward as a core element of its foreign policy and its vision for reshaping global governance.
The U.S. response has involved, as you said, publicly criticizing those negative aspects, but also launching those alternative initiatives like BDN and PGII, framing them as higher quality, values-driven alternatives.
Yes, promoting transparency, sustainability, good governance. But the core critique that comes through in the sources is really about the scale and resources. U.S. and G7 alternatives, while promoting arguably better standards, have so far been significantly smaller in scope, slower to get projects off the ground, and haven't mobilized nearly the same amount of direct financing as China has poured into BRI.
We're talking hundreds of billions from China versus much less committed so far from the West.
Orders of magnitude less in terms of actual, concrete project funding delivered to date. The U.S. and its partners have struggled to offer a truly compelling, equally ambitious alternative package that meets the perceived urgent needs for rapid infrastructure development in many parts of the global South.
So China capitalized on that perceived Western decline, or at least reduced focus, and the strong desire in many developing nations for quick infrastructure development, often with fewer political or environmental strings attached compared to traditional Western aid or loans from international financial institutions like the World Bank or IMF.
That seems to be the dynamic. There is a massive global infrastructure financing gap, estimated in the trillions of dollars. China stepped into that gap decisively and strategically. The U.S. initially focused perhaps more on critiquing BRI's flaws than on proactively providing a sufficiently scaled, attractive alternative vision and funding mechanism. This allowed China to build significant geoeconomic influence, establish itself as a major development partner for dozens of countries, and frame BRI positively in many parts of the world.
The sources also suggest the U.S. maybe initially underestimated the strategic and geopolitical dimensions of BRI, beyond just economics.
Yes, underestimating its role in securing access to strategic ports, building long-term political relationships, gaining influence within countries, and potentially shaping international norms and standards related to infrastructure, technology, and finance. By the time the full strategic implications became clearer in Washington and other Western capitals, China had already made significant inroads and entrenched relationships through BRI across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and even parts of Europe. China's flexibility, sometimes accepting repayment in commodities or adjusting terms, also made it an attractive, albeit potentially risky, partner.
Okay, let's look at another area. China's expanding influence in international organizations, or IOs.
This often ties into periods where the U.S. seemed less engaged or even overtly critical and withdrawing from some IOs.
Particularly during the Trump administration's America First approach, right? Pulling out of the UN Human Rights Council, UNESCO, initiating the withdrawal from the World Health Organization.
Those actions, driven by concerns about cost, fairness, perceived anti-Israel bias, or authoritarian influence within these bodies, undeniably created leadership vacuums. They were widely perceived globally as a sign of U.S. retrenchment from multilateralism.
And even outside of formal withdrawals, the critique is that the U.S. was sometimes slow or inconsistent in countering China's efforts to gain more influence within these organizations, like promoting candidates or pushing certain narratives.
That's the argument. China, in stark contrast, has pursued a very systematic, long-term strategy to increase its engagement and influence across the UN system and other key IOs.
How have they done that?
Several ways. Significantly boosting their financial contributions, which often translates into greater voting power or influence. Actively and successfully promoting Chinese nationals for leadership positions heading key agencies like the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, or the International Telecommunication Union, ITU, at various points, and placing staff throughout the secretariats. And very importantly, actively promoting their own narratives, norms, and global initiatives within these forums.
Narratives like cyber sovereignty or state-centric development models.
Precisely. Pushing concepts like state control over the internet within their borders, development models that prioritize state guidance over market forces or democratic governance, emphasizing non-interference in internal affairs. They use their growing influence to shape agendas, set technical standards, especially in bodies like the ITU, pass resolutions that align with their interests, block criticism of their own practices, particularly on human rights in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, or Tibet, and advance broader geopolitical goals, like systematically isolating Taiwan from participation in international bodies.
The U.S. has worked to re-engage more recently under the Biden administration, rejoining the WHO, the UNHRC.
Yes, there's been a clear effort to re-engage and compete more actively. This includes supporting alternative candidates for leadership positions, advocating for greater transparency and accountability within the IOs, and trying to build coalitions with like-minded democracies to push back against Chinese initiatives or bloc voting.
But the critique in the sources is that these U.S. efforts often feel fragmented, reactive, still hampered by the legacy of past disengagement.
That's a significant concern raised, that U.S. efforts lack a cohesive, long-term, well-resourced strategy to effectively counter China's sustained push for influence, that the U.S. is sometimes perceived as underinvesting the diplomatic capital and personnel needed to compete effectively day in, day out within these bureaucratic structures, and that inconsistent U.S. policies towards multilateralism over time have damaged trust and made coalition building harder.
So China clearly exploited that period of U.S. skepticism and withdrawal.
They skillfully positioned themselves as defenders of multilateralism, as champions of the global South, contrasting themselves favorably with perceived U.S. unilateralism or neglect of these institutions.
The voids created by U.S. absence or reduced engagement were voids China was very prepared and eager to fill.
With increased funding, personnel, and proactive diplomacy. Rhetorically, China effectively used instances of U.S. retrenchment or criticism of IOs to question America's global leadership credentials. This narrative gained traction, particularly among developing countries who felt marginalized by the existing system or welcomed China's seemingly unconditional support.
So the battle playing out within these IOs is fundamentally about more than just bureaucratic influence. It's a battle over narratives and norms.
It really is. China is actively trying to reshape the underlying principles and frameworks of international governance to better align with its state-centric, sovereignty-focused worldview. Pushing back against the liberal internationalist norms, democracy, human rights, free markets, rule of law that the U.S. and its allies traditionally championed, concepts like cyber sovereignty, state-led development, and strict non-interference are central to this effort.
And U.S. inconsistency, absence, or even criticism of these institutions is framed by China as U.S. hypocrisy or unilateralism, weakening the U.S. ability to effectively defend those liberal norms.
That's how China leverages it. It creates a significant long-term challenge for upholding the principles of the post-World War II international order.
Okay, one last case on the China side. The sources touch on the China-India border skirmishes, like the deadly clash in the Galwan Valley in 2020. How does perceived U.S. policy fit in here?
Well, the U.S. views India as an important strategic partner in the Indo-Pacific strategy, seeing democratic India as a vital counterweight to authoritarian China. Cooperation between the U.S. and India has deepened significantly, especially through the Quad security dialogue, which also includes Japan and Australia.
But on the specific long-standing and very sensitive border dispute between China and India, the U.S. position has been more cautious.
Traditionally, yes, emphasizing that the dispute should be resolved peacefully and bilaterally between Beijing and New Delhi. The U.S. avoids taking a formal side on the conflicting territorial claims themselves, not wanting to get dragged into the intricacies of the line of actual control, or LAC.
Could perceived U.S. distraction, maybe by domestic issues or other global crises like Ukraine, or perhaps a belief in Beijing that the U.S. commitment to India has practical limits, embolden China along the border?
That's precisely the dynamic the sources suggest is possible. China might interpret those factors U.S. distraction, or a calculation that the U.S. wouldn't directly intervene in a Sino-Indian border clash as providing more latitude for assertive actions along the LAC.
And China has certainly shown increased military assertiveness there in recent years,
leading to more frequent standoffs, infrastructure buildups, and tragically significant skirmishes like the Galwan Valley clash in June 2020, which resulted in combat fatalities on both sides for the first time in decades, a major downturn in relations. Beijing has also undertaken a substantial military buildup and infrastructure development all along the border, enhancing its ability to rapidly deploy and sustain forces in the high-altitude terrain.
And Beijing sees India's own border infrastructure development and its deepening strategic ties with the U.S., especially through the Quad, in a negative light.
They view it as part of a U.S.-led strategy to contain China, challenging China's security interests on its southern flank. That perception fuels their own actions.
How did the U.S. respond to the Galwan clash and subsequent tensions?
The U.S. offered diplomatic support for India, publicly condemning China's aggression after Galwan. More tangibly, the sources indicate the U.S. significantly increased intelligence sharing with India, real-time intelligence, reportedly helped India anticipate and repel a Chinese incursion in the Tawang sector in late 2022. The U.S. also expedited deliveries of some defense equipment suited for high-altitude warfare, like cold weather gear and surveillance drones.
And overall, the U.S.-India strategic partnership has strengthened further since then. The Quad has been elevated.
Yes, U.S. support was welcomed by India and likely serves as a signal of commitment, possibly acting as a deterrent against further major escalations by China beyond a certain point. However, Beijing publicly criticizes what it calls U.S. interference in a bilateral matter.
And India still maintains its strategic autonomy. It's not a formal U.S. ally.
That's a key point analysts emphasize. India values its independent foreign policy and seeks to manage its complex relationship with China directly, balancing security concerns with significant economic ties and broader geopolitical considerations. This might place limits on how closely India aligns with more overt U.S. anti-China policies. For instance, the sources mention India continuing to pursue bilateral border disengagement agreements with China, even while strengthening ties with the U.S., showing this balancing act.
So China's assertiveness on the border serves as a constant test of the U.S. commitment to India, assessing how far the U.S. is willing to go to support a key partner, but not a treaty ally, in a direct confrontation with China.
Beijing is watching the nature and extent of U.S. support, like intelligence sharing and arms supplies, very closely to gauge U.S. willingness to get involved, short of direct military intervention in a land border dispute thousands of miles away.
Providing intelligence and equipment sends a concrete signal of commitment.
It does. But China may still perceive limits to how far direct U.S. involvement would go, potentially emboldening Beijing to undertake calculated escalations that it believes fall below that threshold for U.S. intervention. The elevation of the Quad is clearly seen by Beijing as a U.S. diplomatic power play to build a united democratic front, and China's strong negative reaction confirms they perceive it as a challenge. China, in turn, will likely continue to probe for fault lines within the Quad, testing its cohesion and trying to demonstrate the perceived limitations of U.S.-led alignments in Asia.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground there, detailing specific cases for both Russia and China, suggesting patterns of how they might exploit perceived U.S. openings. Now, this seems like a good point to step back and connect the dots. What are the common threads, the bigger picture patterns emerging from these examples across different domains? This is where it gets really interesting, seeing the combined effect.
When you look across all these cases, Georgia, Crimea, Syria, the cyber domain for Russia, South China Sea, Taiwan, IP theft, BRI, IOs, India border for China, several common themes in their approaches really stand out in the sources. First, and maybe most obviously, is strategic opportunism and probing.
Both seem highly adept at identifying and then exploiting these perceived windows of opportunity.
When the U.S. is clearly focused on other major crises, Iraq, Afghanistan, the fight against ISIS, now Ukraine, or when there's significant domestic political turmoil, like during contentious election cycles, or moments of policy ambiguity or perceived inconsistency, think strategic ambiguity on Taiwan or the back and forth on Nord Stream 2 sanctions.
They see hesitation, distraction, or maybe a perceived lack of resolve, perhaps inferred from past cautious U.S. responses in places like Georgia or on the Syria red line, as lowering the risks for them to take assertive actions.
That's the calculation suggested. Lower perceived risk, higher potential reward. Second, and we've touched on this repeatedly, is their heavy reliance on gray zone tactics and gradualism.
Operating below the threshold of conventional warfare, cyber attacks, disinformation, using militias or proxies, economic coercion, lawfare, or manipulating legal norms.
Yes. These methods make it much harder for the U.S. and its allies to formulate a timely, clear-cut, and proportional response. It complicates the decision-making process, and it ties into that salami slicing strategy we discussed, particularly with China in the South China Sea. Incremental steps that individually might not seem like a casus belli, but cumulatively change the facts on the ground or in cyberspace, often before a strong consensus for counteraction can form. Attribution can be deliberately obscured or delayed.
A third theme seems to be exploiting legal and normative ambiguities, challenging existing international norms or offering alternative interpretations of international law to justify their actions.
Definitely. We saw Russia invoking the right to protect Russian speakers or challenging Ukrainian sovereignty narratives. We saw China putting forward expansive historical claims in the South China Sea that conflict with UNCLOS, or promoting concepts like cyber sovereignty that challenge norms of internet freedom. They use these ambiguities to create doubt, legitimize their own actions in certain circles, and delegitimize U.S. and Western responses as interference or hypocrisy.
And finally, narrative warfare. Both invest heavily in propaganda and information operations.
Hugely. To control the information space domestically and shape perceptions internationally. To legitimize their actions and territorial claims, justify their worldview, and actively undermine the credibility, influence, and appeal of the U.S. and its democratic allies. It's a key battleground.
The sources also consistently emphasize the role of U.S. domestic political dynamics and policy inconsistency in potentially creating or widening these perceived opportunities for Russia and China.
Yes, this comes up frequently. Significant shifts in U.S. foreign policy from one presidential administration to the next on key alliances, trade agreements, international accords like the Iran deal or Paris Agreement, or even the fundamental approach towards Russia and China themselves create uncertainty.
Uncertainty not just for U.S. allies, but for adversaries too.
Adversaries may interpret that inconsistency, that lack of predictability, as a sign of wavering U.S. commitment or lack of long-term strategic focus. This can signal potential openings for them during periods when the U.S. appears to be vacillating, reassessing, or turning inward.
Increasing domestic political polarization in the U.S. and the often fierce foreign policy debates that play out publicly. that can project an image of a divided America.
It can. And that might be perceived externally, rightly or wrongly, as a sign of a less decisive, less reliable global partner or leader, less able to act cohesively and swiftly on the world stage.
And the narrative, whether accurate or not, of U.S. decline or retrenchment, that can embolden revisionist powers.
If they come to believe that the U.S. lacks the political will, the domestic consensus, or the economic capacity to consistently uphold the existing international order or defend its interests and allies globally, yes, that perception can embolden them to challenge the status quo more assertively.
Now, looking at the effectiveness of U.S. responses across these cases, the sources offer some pretty consistent critiques. Sanctions, for example. They're used frequently, they do impose real costs.
But their effectiveness in actually reversing major actions like annexations
Yeah.
or fundamentally altering adversary behavior in the long run is often limited, especially if the sanctions aren't universally applied by all major economies, if they can be circumvented, like Russia finding new markets in China, or if the targeted adversary receives significant economic or political support from partners.
What about military posturing? Deploying forces, conducting exercises.
That certainly signals commitment and can enhance deterrence. But it can also be perceived as provocative and lead to counter-escalations or accidents. Its ultimate deterrent effect hinges entirely on the adversary's perception of U.S. help. Resolve the perceived willingness to actually use that force if necessary, not just display it.
Diplomatic initiatives. Essential, but often slow.
Often slow, yes. And their success can be undermined by inconsistent U.S. messaging, a lack of complete unity among allies, or simply if the adversary believes it can achieve its objectives through other means and isn't genuinely interested in a negotiated settlement on terms acceptable to the U.S.
And alliances. Arguably America's greatest strategic advantage.
Core advantage. But even their effectiveness can be undermined if allies perceive U.S. commitment as wavering, if divisions emerge within the alliance, which adversaries actively try to exploit, or if adversaries succeed in sowing discord or testing the credibility of U.S. security guarantees. We saw China probing Quad cohesion, for instance.
A recurring theme, really weaving through all these cases, is the impact of U.S. distraction, when Washington's attention is pulled elsewhere.
Yes. Major crises in other regions or significant domestic challenges, economic downturns, political turmoil inevitably divert U.S. attention, resources, and top-level political capital. Russia and China often seem to view these periods as prime windows of opportunity. They calculate, perhaps, that the likelihood of a strong, unified, and strategically focused U.S. response is significantly reduced when Washington is preoccupied.
And how the U.S. responds or fails to respond in one specific theater is watched closely around the world. It influences perceptions of U.S. credibility and resolve everywhere else.
That's emphasized in the sources. Major powers, and U.S. allies too, engage in constant strategic learning. They observe how the U.S. handles a challenge, whether it's enforcing a red line in Syria, responding to the annexation of Crimea, managing the withdrawal from Afghanistan, and they factor those observations into their assessment of likely U.S. reactions in other potential flashpoints, like the South China Sea or Taiwan.
So, U.S. credibility isn't neatly divisible by region. Failures or hesitations can have cascading effects.
Failures or perceived weakness in one area can erode credibility more broadly. This affects not only adversary calculations about risk, but also the confidence of U.S. allies in the reliability of American security commitments.
And those hybrid and gray zone tactics we keep coming back to. They seem specifically designed to exploit the seams in traditional deterrence models. Models often geared towards deterring overt, large-scale conventional aggression.
Precisely. Attribution in cyberspace, or when using proxies or little green men, can be deliberately difficult and time-consuming, creating delays and ambiguity that benefit the aggressor. The incremental nature of salami slicing makes it hard to build domestic and international consensus for a strong response until the situation has already fundamentally shifted, perhaps irreversibly.
And standard responses like sanctions or indictments might not be costly enough if the adversary perceives the strategic benefits of their actions, gaining territory, stealing vital technology, securing resources outweigh those penalties, especially if they've built up economic resilience or found alternative partners.
That asymmetry in perceived costs and benefits is a real challenge. Adversaries may have a higher tolerance for risk or pain in pursuit of what they define as core interests, especially if they believe the U.S. response will ultimately be limited or short-lived.
Finally, the sources note that the U.S. domestic debate itself, particularly the recurring tension between those advocating for deep global engagement versus those favoring more restraint and prioritizing nation building at home, is closely monitored by adversaries.
Very closely. Periods where restraint-focused narratives seem to gain political prominence in the U.S. can be interpreted by Moscow and Beijing as signaling a potential decline in American willingness to play a robust global security role or bear the costs of leadership overseas.
They follow U.S. policy debates, think tank reports, shifts in military doctrine, even public opinion polls on foreign intervention.
All of it. A perceived trend towards reducing overseas military presence, withdrawing from international commitments, or prioritizing domestic issues above all else could be interpreted as a strategic opening, a sign of weakening U.S. posture. This might encourage adversaries to test U.S. resolve more assertively, calculating that the domestic appetite for a strong, costly response is diminished.
Okay, that provides a really solid cross-cutting analysis of the patterns of exploitation we see from both Russia and China when they perceive U.S. hesitation, inconsistency, or distraction. There's another layer to this, isn't there? The sources also emphasize that this challenge is significantly amplified because Russia and China aren't just acting opportunistically on their own anymore, they're increasingly coordinating their actions.
Yes, that's a major finding highlighted across the recent sources, especially focusing on the period from roughly 2018 through to the present. The level and scope of Russia-China coordination have dramatically increased. This fundamentally changes the strategic dynamic.
How is this coordination manifesting itself? Joint military exercises seem like a very visible example.
Extremely visible and significantly expanded. We're talking about a dramatic increase in the frequency, the scale, and the geographic scope of their joint military drills since around 2018. These exercises span from Europe to the Asia-Pacific and are clearly aimed at improving their military interoperability, their ability to operate together effectively, and also sending a very strong political signal of unity against perceived Western pressure.
What's different about the recent exercises compared to earlier ones?
A key departure from past practice, signaling a new level of trust, is the People's Liberation Army, China's military, regularly participating in Russia's large-scale annual strategic exercises drills like Vostok, Center, Kavkaz since 2018. This suggests joint preparation for potential large-scale conflict scenarios.
And they've started doing things together they'd never done before, like joint bomber patrols.
Correct. They conducted their first ever joint strategic bomber patrol in July 2019, flying over the Sea of Japan and East China Sea. This was unprecedented for China with any foreign military. They've continued these patrols annually, conducting around 9 by late 2023. It really underscores the depth of their Air Force coordination.
They've even had Russian troops exercising in China.
Yes. For the first time, Russian troops traveled to China for a major strategic exercise called Zappa Interaction 2021 in Ningxia province in August 2021. And they've ramped up joint naval and air operations significantly, including conducting their first joint naval patrol circling Japan through sensitive straits like Tsugaru in late 2021.
And incredibly, these joint military activities didn't stop or even slow down after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Despite massive Western condemnation and sanctions on Russia?
No, quite the opposite. Some sources suggest the exercises continued and even expanded, explicitly intended, as one report put it, to show off increasingly close defense ties, despite the conflict and intense Western pressure on Russia. President Putin himself attended the large Vostok 2022 exercise alongside participating PLA forces later that year. They held more joint naval drills in the East China Sea and further bomber patrols in late 2022.
And the geographic reach is expanding too.
Yes, in 2023 and 2024, we saw them conducting joint naval drills much further afield, including exercises near Alaska and even conducting their first joint naval patrol in the Arctic Ocean in 2024. With Russia's ground forces heavily committed in Ukraine, the focus of joint exercises has naturally shifted even more towards naval and air force cooperation.
This military relationship seems to be getting quite formalized. Defense cooperation agreements.
Yes, they signed a specific roadmap for military cooperation covering 2021-2025, committing them to deeper ties, more joint exercises and patrols, and likely increased intelligence sharing. There are frequent high-level military exchanges. President Putin himself has described the relationship as being better than an alliance, highlighting its strategic significance while perhaps avoiding the binding mutual defense commitments of a formal treaty.
And the sources mention Russia is even sharing advanced military technology with China, something they were perhaps more hesitant to do in the past.
That's a significant development noted. Technology described as highly sensitive, which is helping to bolster China's own military capabilities much faster than it might otherwise. This likely includes advanced systems like the S-400 air defense missile system, Su-35 fighter jets, and potentially collaboration on highly strategic projects like missile early warning systems.
So the outcome of all this military coordination is what? An unprecedented level of operational familiarity and trust between two major military powers.
They are developing a quasi-allied posture, demonstrating an ability to deconflict their operations and coordinate complex military maneuvers across vast geographic distances, from East Asia all the way to the Arctic, without the constraints or obligations of a formal alliance treaty.
Okay, beyond the military, their economic collaboration has also intensified dramatically, especially since 2022.
Hugely intensified, yes. The Ukraine invasion and subsequent Western sanctions on Russia acted as a major accelerator. China became an economic lifeline for Russia, helping it offset the impact of sanctions. In return, China secured more reliable access to Russian energy and other resources, often at favorable prices.
The trade numbers really tell that story.
They do. Bilateral trade has exploded. It roughly doubled from around $100 billion in 2018 to a record $240.1 billion in 2023. That was a massive 26% increase just from 2022 to 2023. China is now firmly Russia's #1 trading partner by a large margin.
And that surge is driven by China buying huge amounts of Russian oil, gas, coal, agricultural products, while Russia imports much-needed Chinese machinery, cars, electronics, consumer goods.
That's the dynamic. By 2023, China was the #1 buyer of Russian oil, taking about half of its total crude exports. China became Russia's #1 supplier of goods overall and Russia's #2 supplier of coal. They're also actively working together on de-dollarization,
Trying to reduce their reliance on the US dollar in international trade.
settling more of their bilateral trade directly in their own local currencies, the Russian ruble and the Chinese yuan. By 2023, Russia was reportedly using the yuan for over a third of its import settlements. This is a deliberate, long-term strategic goal for both countries to insulate their economies from potential U.S. sanctions and financial pressure and simultaneously strengthen the international role of the yuan. Their leaders have publicly affirmed ambitious targets to boost bilateral trade even further.
Energy cooperation seems absolute fundamental to this economic relationship.
It's the cornerstone. Russia's vast energy resources are a perfect complement to China's massive and growing energy appetite. This has led to landmark long-term deals. We saw the power of Siberia 1 natural gas pipeline come online in 2019 that's based on a 30-year, $400 billion contract. Gas flows through it are steadily increasing, on track to reach the target capacity of 38 billion cubic meters per year by 2025.
And then there's power of Siberia too.
A huge strategic development. A new contract for the second major pipeline was announced in February 2022, right before the Ukraine invasion. It's planned to eventually carry another 50 billion cubic meters of gas annually from fields in western Siberia gas that previously went to Europe, redirecting it towards China. This is a top strategic priority for Russia now. There's also a smaller Far Eastern gas route agreed upon in early 2022. These massive pipeline projects are creating deep, long-term structural interdependence between their economies.
They're also cooperating in other energy sectors,
Right.
nuclear, coal.
Yes. A major contract was signed back in June 2018 for Russia's state nuclear agency, Rosatom, to build 4 new advanced nuclear power reactors in China. It was described as their largest ever nuclear energy deal, worth over $3 billion, and includes significant technology transfer. Construction started in 2021-2022, with operations expected in the late 2020s. On coal, China significantly increased imports of Russian coal, especially after Western sanctions limited Russia's other markets. Russia also exports electricity to China, and there's ongoing discussion and some investment involving Chinese firms taking stakes in Russian joint ventures for Arctic mining projects and liquefied natural gas (LNG) development.
How does China's Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, fit into this Russia-China economic picture? Are they coordinating there too?
They are. Officially, the BRI is framed as having strategic overlaps or synergies with Russia's own regional integration project, the Eurasian Economic Union, EAU. Back in 2015, they issued a joint statement pledging to coordinate the development of the Silk Road Economic Belt, the overland part of BRI, with the EAU. The stated goal was to seek complementary development projects, particularly in Central Asia, rather than direct competition.
So in practice, new railroads.
Yes, new freight rail routes connecting China to Europe now run through Russia, forming an important part of the BRI's Eurasian land bridge. China has also invested in upgrading Russian rail infrastructure to facilitate this transit trade. President Putin has also explicitly proposed linking the BRI with Russia's ambitions in the Arctic, particularly developing the Northern Sea route as a polar Silk Road. China's official Arctic policy, released in 2018, stated its intent to work with Russia on developing polar shipping routes and energy resources. And indeed, Chinese state-owned firms have provided significant financing and construction expertise for major Russian Arctic LNG projects and associated port infrastructure. Cross-border infrastructure between Russia and China themselves is also improving, with new highway and rail bridges finally completed over the Amur River in recent years. So the BRI and Russia's broader Eurasian economic agenda are becoming increasingly intertwined and mutually reinforcing.
And on technology and industrial partnerships, Russia, facing Western sanctions and export controls, seems to be turning increasingly to Chinese technology.
Increasingly, yes. And China has generally welcomed this collaboration, seeing Russia as both a valuable market for its tech companies and a source of advanced scientific know-how in certain areas where Russia retains strengths. In telecommunications, for instance, after Western suppliers like Ericsson and Nokia pulled out of Russia post-2022, and facing the ongoing U.S. campaign against Huawei, Russia deepened its partnership with Huawei for 5G network development. They signed a key deal back in June 2019.
So Huawei benefits from the Russian market, and Russia gets access to 5G tech it might otherwise struggle to obtain.
Huawei has become a primary supplier of network equipment in Russia. Beyond 5G, they're pursuing joint research in other areas of ICT, artificial intelligence, and cybersecurity. Russian companies are increasingly pivoting to Chinese suppliers for components like semiconductors and servers following Western blocs, often with the tacit approval of the Chinese government.
And cooperation extends into really strategic sectors like space and aviation too.
Yes, some landmark agreements there. A major one was the plan announced in March 2021 for a joint China-Russia International Lunar Research Station, or ILRS. They plan to jointly build this base on the moon based on principles of co-consultation, joint construction, and shared benefits. This signals a very high level of strategic trust and envisions long-term collaboration on lunar exploration, coordinating their respective missions, and even establishing a joint data center.
What about aviation?
They've been co-developing a wide-body passenger jet, the CRAX CR929, since 2017. The goal is explicitly to challenge the long-standing Boeing-Airbus duopoly in the large aircraft market by combining Russian aerospace expertise with Chinese industrial capacity and financing. Although this project has faced significant delays and challenges exacerbated by sanctions, they also cooperate on making their satellite navigation systems, China's Beidou and Russia's GLONASS, interoperable and compatible. Discussions are also reported on potential collaboration on heavy-lift helicopters and advanced jet engines.
And R&D in other high-tech fields.
Yes, the sources mention joint research and development initiatives in areas like next-generation 5G, 6G wireless technologies, quantum computing, biotechnology, and financial technology, fintech. Russia's efforts to build a more sovereign domestic internet infrastructure also appear to lean heavily on Chinese technology and expertise in areas like filtering and control. We also see the growing presence of Chinese companies in the Russian market for things like electric vehicles and batteries, and partnerships between Russian science institutes and Chinese counterparts in fields like supercomputing and AI. They also cooperate on advanced nuclear technologies like fast breeder reactors and closing the nuclear fuel cycle. It's consistently presented by both sides as a series of mutually beneficial win-win partnerships.
So putting all that economic and tech collaboration together, the big picture outcome is China providing markets, investment, and supply chains that significantly help Russia mitigate the impact of Western sanctions, while Russia in turn ensures China has access to reliable, long-term supplies of energy and other natural resources, often bypassing sea lanes controlled by the U.S. Navy.
That's the core dynamic. Record high trade volumes, deepening infrastructure links, joint work on major strategic projects. This tight, growing economic interdependence clearly underpins and reinforces their broader political alignment and their ability to present a more united front on the global stage.
Which brings us neatly to their coordination in multilateral institutions and how they align their stances on major global conflicts and issues.
Yes, this is another area where their coordination has become much more visible and systematic. They present an increasingly unified front across a wide range of international forums, obviously as permanent members of the UN Security Council, but also within groups like BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and its new members, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, and others.
And they seem to coordinate their positions on specific issues like Syria, Iran, cyber governance, often to counter U.S. or Western influence and norms.
Precisely. They share a fundamental worldview that emphasizes state sovereignty, non-interference in internal affairs, and seeks to promote what they call a multipolar international order, explicitly pushing back against what they perceive as a US-led unipolar system or hegemony.
At the UN, their voting record in the Security Council is particularly striking, especially their use of the veto.
Very striking. They frequently use their veto power in tandem. For example, in 2019 alone, they jointly vetoed 3 different resolutions related to the humanitarian situation in Syria, effectively shielding the Assad government from council action. This pattern of China almost always vetoing alongside Russia on major geopolitical issues goes back to at least 2011. They also coordinate their votes on issues concerning countries like Venezuela or Myanmar, generally favoring dialogue and opposing sanctions or intervention. On North Korea, they've jointly proposed easing sanctions and jointly vetoed a US-led resolution to impose new sanctions in May 2022, breaking a long period of council unity on DPRK sanctions.
So they effectively provide diplomatic cover for each other's core interests and actions.
It's a very reciprocal relationship in that sense. China has consistently abstained on or effectively sided with Russia regarding resolutions condemning the invasion of Ukraine at both the Security Council and the General Assembly, shielding Moscow from stronger UN censure. In return, Russia firmly and consistently backs China's position on sensitive issues like Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and Taiwan, opposing any external criticism or perceived interference in China's internal affairs, particularly regarding human rights. They often coordinate statements, for instance, at the UN Human Rights Council, jointly opposing resolutions critical of either government's policies and strongly emphasizing the principle of non-interference.
And in forums outside the UN, like BRICS and the SCO, they're actively working together to build alternative structures or push alternative agendas.
Yes, very actively. Within BRICS, which they have jointly championed expanding, they issued joint statements that often criticize unilateral sanctions and protectionism, usually aimed at the US, and call for reform of the global financial architecture to give developing countries a greater voice. They are pushing for alternatives to the US dollar in international trade and finance, supporting initiatives like the BRICS New Development Bank, and exploring concepts like a BRICS reserve currency, all aimed at gradually reshaping the global financial system.
And the SCO, primarily focused on Central Asia.
The SCO is used to drive security and economic cooperation in Central Asia and broader Eurasia. Its expansion to include India, Pakistan, and now Iran is seen as an effort to build it into a major Eurasian counterweight to Western blocs like NATO. SCO statements typically reflect a consensus view that emphasizes combating terrorism, separatism, and extremism, often defined broadly, and opposing external interference in the region's affairs. Beijing often echoes Moscow's narrative that Western alliances provoke instability, while Moscow supports Beijing's conceptual frameworks like the Global Security Initiative or the Community of Common Destiny.
That high-profile no-limit strategic partnership statement they issued together in Beijing in February 2022, just weeks before the Ukraine invasion, really encapsulated this alignment, didn't it?
It was a landmark statement. They explicitly stated their opposition to further NATO expansion and criticized what they called the formation of closed blocs and an emerging Cold War mentality in the Asia-Pacific region, clearly aimed at U.S. alliances and the Quad. And crucially, they mutually upheld each other's core territorial claims and security concerns. Russia stated Taiwan is an inalienable part of China and opposed any form of Taiwan independence, while China stated it understood and supported Russia's proposals regarding security guarantees in Europe and opposed NATO enlargement. They also coordinate stances in broader forums like the G20, often working together to resist efforts to isolate Russia, and at the World Trade Organization, criticizing protectionism and U.S. trade actions like tariffs.
The war in Ukraine since February 2022 has really been the ultimate litmus test of this coordination, hasn't it?
It has, and China has navigated it very carefully, maintaining what's often described as a pro-Russian neutrality. As we noted at the UN, China abstained on key resolutions condemning the invasion, providing diplomatic cover for Moscow.
They refused to call it an invasion in official statements.
Correct. Their official statements studiously avoid that term and often echo Russian grievances, frequently blaming NATO expansion as the root cause of the conflict. According to the Kremlin's readout of a phone call between President Xi and Putin in June 2022, Xi reaffirmed support for Russia on issues of sovereignty and security, and noted the legitimacy of actions taken by Russia to protect fundamental national interests in the face of challenges to its security created by external forces.
They stress understanding Russia's security concerns and strongly oppose the Western sanctions imposed on Russia.
Strongly oppose the sanctions. Their official position calls for a peaceful resolution respecting sovereignty and territorial integrity, outlined in a rather vague 12-point peace proposal that gained little international traction. But in practice, as we discussed, China has provided a vital economic lifeline to Russia through massively increased energy purchases and the supply of dual-use technologies and components that help sustain Russia's war effort and economy. Diplomatically, China's position consistently works to dilute international condemnation of Russia.
Russia welcomes China's diplomatic initiatives, of course.
Of course. While China has carefully stopped short of providing direct lethal military aid to Russia, likely calculating that doing so would trigger devastating secondary sanctions from the West, the overall impact of its economic support and diplomatic alignment has been profound. China has clearly enabled Russia to withstand Western pressure to a much greater degree than would otherwise have been possible. The conflict, paradoxically, seems to have drawn them even closer, solidifying their partnership against what they both perceive as a hostile West. The unity in their messaging jointly condemning Western sanctions, accusing NATO of provocation, shows tight synchronization.
And on Taiwan, which China considers its absolute core interest, Russia's support for Beijing's stance is unequivocal.
Completely unequivocal, Russia consistently reiterates its adherence to the One China principle and opposes any form of Taiwan independence. After then, U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan in August 2022, triggering a major crisis, Russia firmly sided with Beijing, calling the visit a provocation and labeling the U.S. a state provocateur.
That strong, explicit endorsement of China's red lines by Moscow was surely noted with appreciation in Beijing, a sign of true strategic partnership.
It was highlighted by Chinese officials as evidence of genuine friendship and strategic trust. And in return, China provides rhetorical support for Russia against sanctions and NATO expansion. It's a clear quid pro quo. Each backs the other on their most sensitive core security interests. They are aligned in criticizing increased U.S. military activity in and around the Taiwan Strait. Russian officials have publicly defended China's right to protect its sovereignty following large-scale PLA military drills conducted in response to U.S. official visits to Taiwan. This synchronization demonstrates just how deeply intertwined their diplomatic interests have become. Beijing counts on Moscow's political backing on Taiwan, and Moscow counts on Beijing's political cover and economic support regarding Ukraine and sanctions.
What about the South China Sea? Does Russia align with China there too, despite having relationships with other claimant states like Vietnam?
It's a bit more nuanced there, but overall subtly supportive of China's position against external actors. Officially, Russia states it takes no sides on the specific territorial claims themselves. However, it consistently echoes China's opposition to what they both term outside interference in regional disputes, meaning primarily U.S. involvement. Russia has criticized U.S. freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea as destabilizing. And importantly, Russia publicly backed China's rejection of the 2016 international arbitration ruling, arguing that disputes should be resolved only by the parties directly involved, not through external mechanisms. Rhetorically, Russia often supports China's position by framing U.S. actions in the region as provocative.
Even though Russia maintains, for example, significant energy development partnerships with Vietnam, another major claimant in the South China Sea.
Yes, they seem to carefully compartmentalize those specific economic relationships to prevent them from harming the overarching strategic partnership with China. They've even included the South China Sea in their joint military diplomacy, conducting joint naval drills there back in 2019, which sends a signal of a united front against U.S. alliances and military presence in this maritime region. Both countries strongly oppose the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy and initiatives like AUKUS, the Australia-UK-U.S. Security Pact, viewing them as attempts at containment. They jointly promote an ASEAN-centered regional security architecture instead of what they see as U.S.-dominated exclusive blocs. Strategically, Russia aligns with China by calling for a reduced U.S. role in Asian maritime disputes, which ultimately bolsters China's position.
And their coordination extends to other global issues as well. Iran, Afghanistan, cyber governance.
Yes, a consistent pattern. On Iran, both opposed the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA nuclear deal and worked together, along with European powers, to try and salvage it. After the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, they coordinated efforts through the SCO and other regional forums. On cyber governance, they strongly advocate for a state-centric model emphasizing national sovereignty over internet control, pushing back against the U.S.-favored multi-stakeholder model promoting a free and open internet. In climate change negotiations, they often coordinate positions, emphasizing the development rights of emerging economies and pushing back against perceived burdens imposed by developed countries. And as we mentioned earlier, they have actively led the creation and expansion of parallel international institutions, the New Development Bank, BRICS Bank, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, IIB, led by China but with Russian participation, the SCO, the Conference on Interaction and Confidence Building Measures in Asia, SIG-ICA, all reflecting a shared long-term aim to reduce Western dominance in global governance and build alternative structures more aligned with their interests.
So putting it all together, on the world stage, they operate almost as an effective bloc, even without a formal alliance treaty.
Increasingly so. Their unified voting patterns, joint statements, and ability to use their tandem vetoes in the UN Security Council can effectively stymie Western initiatives and protect their own interests and allies, like Syria or North Korea. They lend significant weight and legitimacy to the narrative of a rising East and global South pushing back against perceived Western dominance or unilateralism. The recent expansion of BRICS, strongly championed by both China and Russia, is a clear strategic move aimed at amplifying this non-Western voice and influence in global affairs.
Okay, that gives us a really clear picture, based on the sources, of how Russia and China not only seem to strategically leverage perceived gaps or shifts in U.S. foreign policy individually, often using similar gray zone tactics,
but also how they're dramatically increasing coordination across military, economic, technological, and diplomatic fronts significantly amplifies the challenge they pose collectively to the existing global order and U.S. interests.
It really underscores that in this era of intensifying great power competition, perceptions matter immensely. Perceptions of national will, strategic clarity, the credibility of commitments. These seem almost as important as tangible military or economic power. And U.S. domestic dynamics, policy shifts, perceived distractions, they are being monitored and factored into the strategic calculations of both Moscow and Beijing.
The sources collectively make a compelling case that a failure by the U.S. to project consistent strength, predictable policy, and unified purpose can inadvertently create voids or opportunities that revisionist powers, like Russia and China, are clearly prepared and increasingly coordinating to exploit. The core challenge for the U.S., therefore, is navigating this incredibly complex landscape, figuring out how to effectively deter aggression and defend its interests and allies without triggering catastrophic conflict, all while managing significant domestic demands and other global crises that inevitably arise.
So based on the patterns, the critiques, the analyses we've discussed from these sources, what do they suggest might constitute a more effective strategy for the U.S. going forward in managing this competition? What recommendations emerge?
Several key recommendations consistently surface from the analysis across these different cases. First, and perhaps foremost, is the need for enhanced strategic clarity and consistency from the United States.
Meaning clear goals, clear red lines, minimizing policy swings between administrations,
articulating clear, realistic, long-term goals and, where possible, unambiguous red lines regarding unacceptable actions by both Russia and China, and striving for much greater policy continuity and predictability, particularly across presidential administrations. This likely requires fostering a deeper, more sustainable bipartisan consensus within the U.S. on core national security interests related to these competitors. U.S. rhetoric needs to be consistently and credibly backed by the necessary military and economic capabilities, demonstrated political will to act, and predictable policy follow-through. Mixed signals, hesitation, or sudden reversals are consistently shown to be damaging to deterrence and alliance credibility. Second, strengthening deterrence itself, but adapting it for the current challenges, not just relying on traditional military power. Precisely. Continuing to bolster conventional military deterrence in regions like Europe and the Indo-Pacific is essential, ensuring U.S. forces are appropriately positioned, equipped, trained, and resourced for the specific threats they might face. But equally important is developing more robust and agile deterrence capabilities, specifically designed to counter cyber and gray zone challenges.
What does that entail?
It means clearer articulation of unacceptable behaviors in these domains, a credible commitment to imposing timely and significant costs when those lines are crossed, costs that might need to go beyond just sanctions or indictments to be truly effective, and improving capabilities for rapid, reliable attribution of attacks, and developing a wider range of proportional response options. It also involves proactively integrating economic tools into deterrent strategy, building allied resilience against economic coercion, offering attractive economic alternatives to counter adversary influence initiatives like BRI, and being prepared to use economic leverage more strategically.
Third, the sources emphasize revitalizing and adapting alliance management, leveraging that key U.S. strength.
Paramount. Reinvesting deeply in alliances and partnerships is crucial. This involves fostering a shared understanding of the threats posed by Russia and China among allies, and coordinating responses much more closely and consistently. It also means encouraging allies to increase their own defense spending and develop the specific capabilities needed to contribute effectively to collective defense and deterrence, burden sharing, and unequivocally reaffirming U.S. security commitments where vital interests are at stake, perhaps seeking greater clarity on the scope and nature of those commitments where ambiguity is no longer serving its purpose. Building collective resilience with allies against all forms of coercion, economic pressure, disinformation campaigns, cyber attacks is also essential, as is continuing to promote military interoperability.
Fourth, the need for more proactive engagement globally, shaping the narrative, offering alternatives.
Yes. Moving beyond just reacting. Actively competing in the global information domain is critical countering adversary narratives, exposing their malign activities, and consistently promoting the benefits of a rules-based international order. This requires sustained investment and a coordinated, whole-of-government information strategy. It also means leading by offering genuinely attractive, transparent, and sustainable alternatives to initiatives like China's BRI, focusing on high-quality development and good governance, but this requires allocating sufficient resources and streamlining U.S. development finance processes to actually compete effectively on the ground. And as we discussed, proactively engaging within international organizations is vital, working with allies to shape norms, set standards, influence agendas, and actively counter adversary efforts to reshape these bodies from within.
Fifth, the challenge of managing distractions and sustaining strategic focus on this long-term competition.
A very difficult but crucial challenge. Developing mechanisms and habits within the U.S. government to maintain strategic focus on great power competition, even when other urgent crises erupt domestically or internationally. This again points back to the importance of fostering greater bipartisan domestic consensus on the core national security interests related to Russia and China. Such consensus can provide the foundation for policy continuity across administrations and project a much-needed image of unified national resolve to both allies and adversaries. And finally, a point that underpins all of this. The sources emphasize the need for the U.S. to invest more deeply and systematically in understanding adversary perceptions, strengthening U.S. intelligence collection and, just as importantly, analytical capabilities to truly grasp how Moscow and Beijing perceive U.S. actions, policies, intentions, and perceived weaknesses or resolve. Accurately understanding their strategic culture, their risk calculus, their decision-making processes is absolutely key to formulating effective deterrence and competition strategies. Misreading their perceptions can lead to policy failures.
So pulling it all together, what does this really tell us? These sources paint a compelling, if concerning, picture. A picture of two major powers, Russia and China, strategically identifying and leveraging perceived moments of U.S. hesitation, inconsistency, or distraction across a whole range of domains: military, cyber, economic, diplomatic.
Using similar playbooks involving gray zone tactics, narrative warfare, and exploiting ambiguities, and increasingly coordinating their efforts, multiplying the challenge they pose to the existing global order and U.S. leadership.
Understanding these patterns, the methods of exploitation, the growing coordination seems crucial for anyone trying to navigate this complex era of great power competition. It's not just about counting tanks or ships, it's about understanding strategy, perception, and political will.
It really is.
As you reflect on all these cases we've discussed, from Georgia to the South China Sea, from cyber attacks to influence in international organizations, maybe consider this final thought. How much might the perception of resolve and unity, both domestically, within the U.S., and internationally among its allies, be just as important, perhaps even more important than raw military or economic strength, in shaping the geopolitical landscape ahead? What really stands out to you from these examples?
Gray zones have become roadmaps, red lines, blueprints, and every delay, every inconsistency from the West gets logged, studied, and used. Russia and China are no longer just reacting. They're aligning, diplomatically, economically, militarily, not as allies, but as architects of something else. In the final episode of this series, we ask what's left of the rules-based order, and what comes next when the rules are no longer respected, but still claimed.
Please like and subscribe.